Good morning, everyone. As anyone who follows the news in India with anything more than cursory interest knows, things are not that great in the world's largest democracy, and they haven't been for several years now. A lot of the daily Twitter fights and social media battles that we've become used to now are really about who's to blame. Opposition parties would naturally insist that things have gotten immeasurably worse since the BJP government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power in 2014, while the BJP and its acolytes have elevated blaming past rulers. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb and India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru are their particular favorites for a host of the ills that India suffers from today. Now, it is a bit of a stretch to imagine that everything was terrible before 2014 and then got magically better the moment Mr. Modi came to power. But it is also rather odd to imagine that everything was brilliantly great before 2014 and went racing to hell in a handbasket the moment Mr. Modi came to power. Many of the deeper malaises that afflict India and Indians, things that affect daily lives, basic things, healthcare, education, jobs, incomes, poverty in general, environmental pollution, and even the corruption of our polity, which we generally call criminalization of politics here, go back a long way. As this very interesting and also a little depressing book shows. So where are we as a country headed? To tell us about their deeply researched views on this, we have with us the authors of the book, Debasish Roy Chaudhary and Professor John Keane.
Hello.
Debasish, yeah. Hi, Debasish. Hi, John. Debasish Roy Chaudhary is a journalist now based in Calcutta, earlier based in Hong Kong. He has worked in Calcutta, Sao Paulo, Hua Hin, Bangkok, and Beijing. And he is a recipient of multiple journalism prizes, including the Human Rights Press Award and the Society of Publishers in Asia Award. He is also a Jefferson Fellow. John Keane is Professor of Politics at the University of Sydney and the WZB Berlin. He is renowned globally for his creative thinking about democracy and is the author of a number of distinguished books, including The Life and Death of Democracy and The New Despotism. So welcome both of you. And to begin with, I'll just, since some of our viewers may not already have read the book, if you could please just run us through a brief introduction of what the book is talking about and basically give us a little overview of what's inside.
This is a book about the fate of Janatantra, democracy in India. It is, we say, a book that draws upon a lot of scholarship and more journalistic writing about democracy in India. We acknowledge our debts, for example, to the wonderful work of Amartya Sen. We engage with a tradition of writing about democracy that, for example, goes back to Rajni Kothari, one of the founders of that field of research. What we find, at least as we were working on the book, is that much of that literature was persuaded that India was on the road to a democracy, that India was doing things to the spirit and substance of democracy, that India was Indianizing democracy. There was a strong belief in a kind of evolutionary ascent towards a more interesting, open, plural democracy. And what we say in the opening pages of our book is that there are certainly truths in that view. We call it the India story. The India story says India did something really remarkable in the middle of the 20th century. It was the first great post-colonial state that began to build electoral democracy. It avoided over the years dictatorship, which was the fate of so many African states, post-colonial states. It did indeed introduce innovations like secularism, the principle that India comprises many different faiths and they should be protected in their dignity, and the role of the state is to protect them and to empower those different faiths. It's a story which we point out in the opening pages of the book, ironically, has been propped up by outside views, a strange kind of Orientalism where, and particularly the United States, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, every president speaks about, until today, Joe Biden speaks about India as the world's largest democracy. Well, what our book tries to say is that there are a few things, serious things, that are wrong with that India story and many previous accounts of democracy. Things are not going well. Our view is that India is actually the world's largest failing democracy. And we say in our book that the world should really pay attention to what is going on in India, that India is of global importance. The fate of democracy in India will affect the global fate of democracy. This briefly, a few words about the thrust of the book along the way. We have lots to say about what democracy has meant and can mean. It is, we say, we can talk about this later, it's not altogether a pessimistic book, Samrat. Okay. Actually, it can be read in quite the opposite way, as a book about how democracies can live, okay, survive and thrive.
Okay. Deb?
So as John says that it can also be read as a book, How Democracies Can Live and Thrive. I would just like to mention that the book, or the brief structure of the book, is that the book doesn't just look at elections and governing institutions to evaluate what the current state of India's democracies. It also looks at how Indians access the most basic ingredients of life, such as air, water, healthcare, education, and what that says about our democracy, because we say in the book that democracy is a whole way of life. It's not just about democratic institutions. So what we have tried to do in the book is take a look at both the institutional features of democracy, such as elections, the legislatures, the party system, the judiciary, the media, and all of that, and also what we call the social foundations of democracy, which is this healthcare and the transport and worker rights, education, all of that.
Okay.
Perhaps I might just add a few words, Deb, to that. The book does engage with the present, booming literature industry on the decline of democracy, the crisis of democracy. Our approach does, as Deb has just said, it does offer a reminder that historically democracy was always considered a whole way of life, in which equalization of life chances was seen to be central. This book is in a way old-fashioned. I mean, it is a reminder of that old principle. It is in this sense opposed to neoliberal thinking about democracy, where privatization of business and deregulation of state institutions and allowing money to rule is a precondition of democracy. We are very critical of that view. We're also against metaphors like backsliding, the reference to the backsliding of democracies. Our sense of Indian history since the middle of the 20th century is different. I think our view is different than the Levitsky-Ziblatt book about how democracies die, because we emphasize the importance of social foundations. And one last thing, I suppose a basic rule when reading this book is to see that we are contesting what so many Indian politicians are saying. I mean, in a way, the spirit of this book is captured in Aravind Adiga's White Tiger, both the book and the film, where someone says, if you want to understand Indian politics, listen to what politicians say, turn it on its head, and you come much closer to the truth. Well, I think that spirit, runs through our book.
Okay. Well, you've talked about the social foundations, and half the book is about the social foundations. And we get things like starvation. There's the case of that story about Budhni Brijia, who dies of starvation. And you've got the Global Hunger Index ranking, where India features at 94th place along with Sudan, and so on and so forth. And water scarcity, pollution, all the social foundations. And obviously, we are not really doing well on those social indicators. Now, politically, somehow it seems that most people in the upper middle classes, although those definitions themselves are also contested, middle class in India, but people tend somehow to ignore these facts, these crumbling of the social foundations. And oddly enough, even the people most directly affected or worst affected by these failures, social failures, this crumbling of the social foundations, somehow don't seem to connect it with politics. When they're voting, they tend to vote on emotive factors related to identity, such as religion or caste, for example. Now, why do you think that happens, that we fail to connect these crumbling social foundations with politics?
That's a very interesting question, Samrat. But you know what? People do often ask each other the same things in conversations with our friends and family and acquaintances. Or we do often ask, why don't political parties talk about our pathetic healthcare system? Why is it that the poor state of public education is never an election issue? So my mother, for example, every day, unfailingly, she complains about inflation and wonders why politicians do not talk about it. There are no other issues other than inflation, because it's eating up her savings. So I think people do connect substantive social and economic politics. But the problem is that what are they going to do about it? Will my mother take a placard out tomorrow and walk down the street demanding higher interest rate and low inflation? Uh, Obviously not, because that's what political parties are supposed to do. That's why you have this thing called opposition. So the problem is not that the people do not connect social failures with politics. The problem is politicians do not. And you know why? Because they don't have to. They don't serve the people anymore. Thanks to the primacy of money in politics, their main priority is the special interests that finance them. And would like to remind you of the India Against Corruption. Now know that it was organized by the RSS behind the scenes, but you will remember the spontaneous and the wholehearted support it received from across India. The man on the street didn't know who was really behind it. He just came out because he was excited that someone finally was making corruption a political action to end it. So parties to connect social failures with politics, but they're both reluctant and incapable of. The sad thing is that political parties have turned into these vote harvesting machines where money is the raw material. So the more raw material you feed the machine, the more votes you produce. As a result, the political parties are losing the ability and appetite for mass politics. And like all major mass politics on substantive issues now come from non-political entities. Take the farmers' movement, for example. Take the movement against law, for example. Political parties are mostly absent from agitations on most important issues facing the country today. In fact, they have become so disconnected from the electorate. They now hire consultants is to tell them what voters want. And I mean, that's how dead mass politics is. And the emergencies we describe in the book do not figure in politics. It's not because people do not connect with them, it's because politicians do not have to engage with them. That's the problem.
Perhaps I may add to what Deb has said, because running through the middle part of our book is an account of the destruction of dignity, the growing sense of powerlessness of millions of people who feel that they can't do anything, that parties do not fully represent them, that there are tycoons up there and governments that don't respond. I mean, running through our book is an account of how the spirit of democracy is destroyed slowly but surely when the social preconditions of democracy become very uneven and begin to be riddled, you know, with inequality and other all kinds of injustices. For example, when the foundations of a democracy begin to be ruined, then a sense that the courts, you know, can't help, a sense of legal powerlessness, a sense of cynicism about laws working for people, or some of the degradation that we document in the book is very painful. You know, when citizens suffer poor diet or poisonous air or contaminated water, I mean, citizens are literally killed. Our evidence is that something like nearly 2.5 million treatable illnesses result in death in India, or, you know, 1/3 of India's children are stunted. So, you know, the destruction of dignity, the taking of life unnecessarily, is also part of the story of the failure to build a the social conditions, you know, for a flourishing democracy.
So you mentioned the primacy of money, Deb. You talked about, you know, how money has become the raw material, and how political parties in general have disconnected from social issues, as it were. They can get away with not really engaging with the key issues that affect people's daily lives, such as inflation and so on. So I'll take this to John. John, you've used words like cremocracy and polygarchy in the book. Could you please explain a little bit more about these terms?
Yes, I hope viewers and listeners won't be scared off by these big words, some neologisms that we adopt in the book. Cremocracy is one of them. It is actually a word in the dictionary from money and rule. We introduced actually a Hungarian term also in the book called polygarchy to describe this kind of entangle of the power of business people and government officials. You know, that's going on in many democracies. It's certainly happening in India. Behind this attempt to introduce new terms is, I would say, the feeling of us as authors that a different language was needed to capture the dynamics that we want to and do try to emphasize in this book. I mean, in the history of democracy, there are periods where writers, thinkers, citizens reach the conclusion that a new poetry is required, you know, to make sense of the novelty of trends, whether they're positive or negative. That happened, for instance, on a very impressive scale in the 1940s, when representative democracies were on their knees. You know, 11 representative democracies left in 1941, and out of the ashes of 2 global wars and concentration camps and terrible violence and displacement of peoples, democracy was reborn. India played in the form of B.R. Ambedkar, for example, played a very important role in rejuvenating the language and kind of changing the poetry of democracy. Well, we don't claim to be poets, but we do say in this book that actually a different way of writing and talking about democracy in India is needed. And that's why we pay so much attention to key terms, including a rather old-fashioned word, which we try to give a new meaning to, a word that appears in the subtitle of the book, despotism. Here, just a couple of sentences and I'll stop. Here, there's a long story to be told about how India was accused of suffering despotism, for example, by James Mill and John Stuart Mill and other liberal English imperialists. You know, the subcontinent is a patch of the earth where most people are asleep and subservient, and they succumb to rulers. What we do in this book is take that word and give it a new meaning to describe what could happen to India unless the trends that we document are stopped. What is a despotism? It's a Russian or Chinese or Saudi or Turkish or Hungarian type polity, where there is concentrated wealth and power at the top. It's a pyramid in which there are elections, in which there's lots of talk of democracy, in which corruption is rampant. But the truth is that most people are excluded from power, that the people, in the name of the people, in the name of democracy, in the name of elections, are marginalized. And despotism in this way is what we call at one point a phantom democracy. That is a danger which we say confronts Indian democracy. And in this respect, our use of the word despotism is an alternative to thinking about the dangers of what Christophe Jaffrelot and others call Hindu majoritarianism. Things are worse than that. And we have a different language in which to make sense of a whole range of trends that Deb has already mentioned, you know, courts, elections, the role of dark money, the violence of everyday life, the environmental pollution, and so on. This is a different way of trying to write, let's say, to begin writing a new poetry of democracy in India.
You mentioned Hungary, and I noticed that in the book you mentioned, you've given the example of Viktor Orban's Hungary as a mafia state. And I noticed that many of the things that you said about Hungary seemed rather familiar sitting here in India. So, for example, mafia governments led by big-mouthed demagogues do everything they can to concentrate political power in their own hands. They publicly attack journalists and independent media, public service bureaucracies, independent judiciaries, and other power monitoring institutions. They're gripped by an inner urge to destroy checks, balances, and mechanisms for publicly scrutinizing and restraining powers. Mafia politics has no taste or time for institutional give and take politics. So a lot of these things seem rather familiar here. So would you say that we are perhaps unfortunately heading in that direction or have headed in that direction?
John, why don't you take this?
Well, yes, I have to say that I agree with every one of those words, even if Deb and I wrote them. I think, yes, running through our book is a warning. It's a precautionary tale that unless some very basic, powerful trends are stopped or reversed in India, then it is possible, despite all of the complexity of social and cultural and religious life in India, despite the vast geographical spread and the proto-federalism of the polity, it is possible that that democracy in India, understood as self-government of the people of India, can degenerate, can morph into something different. And this idea of democracy being vulnerable to despotism, to the concentration of power, of arbitrary power in the name of the people, backed by elections that are riddled with money and corruption and so on. That is an old idea in the analysis of democracy. It goes well back into the 19th century. And what we say, and the quotation makes clear, Samrat, is that there are actually existing cases of this in our time. Hungary is one of them, but it is only one. Serbia could be added to this growing list of power-sharing democracies that degenerate and morph into some kind of despotic rule. Turkey is on its way. Most of the Central Asian republics after the collapse of the Soviet Union and immediately following the first free and fair elections degenerated into, or if you like, morphed into some kind of despotic rule. And it happened in Russia with the collapse of the Soviet empire. So one of the rules that we highlight in this book is that there are existing cases going on in our 21st century world, and disturbingly, there is a proposition running through the book, which is that you can, a political group can effect this, this transformation of democracy into despotism very quickly. In the case of Hungary, not much more than a decade, not much more than a decade in the Russian case. Putinism is an expression of that. Building a democracy, by contrast, is slow motion work. It takes time. It takes decades to consolidate. Democracy can be transformed not only by coups d'états, not only by military intervention and the big blow. They can be transformed quite quickly, we show in this book, by despotic methods. And that we hope readers of this book will find disturbing.
Deb, in the book, both of you used examples not just of the BJP or BJP ruled states, but also of other parties and other states. So within India, would you say that this is a tendency, this trend towards despotism is something which seems to be playing itself out within different states and through different parties? Would you agree with such a proposition?
Yes, I think despotism is more a manifestation of the problems that we have, but the problems are more structural, and that's uniform across the country in various shades, of course. But the problems in Uttarakhand are not the same as in uh, India, but overall, for example, there are pockets of decent public health care in India, but overall the picture is pretty bad. So similarly, overall the picture of school education system, the public school education system is pretty bad. So the fundamental the fundamental structural problems are more or less uniform, and what we have is a manifestation of that in the rise of despotism. You look at, we have said West Bengal, we have, or we see that in KCR's Telangana. Um, we see that in YSR's Andhra, and even the person YSR replaced was no different from YSR actually. So, these are the same people. Uh,
And perhaps we could add that it's an exaggeration, but with some truth in it, that despots in democracies that are suffering tend to hunt in packs. A Telangana member of parliament says that if people do not vote for a party in Uttar Pradesh in the forthcoming election, the bulldozers will be brought in. I mean, that very language is a corruption of the language of democracy. It is a corruption of conscience. It's a corruption of the principle of give and take, of openness. It's threatening language that feeds the engine of despotism, let's say. So hunting in packs is the problem. It exists in India.
Okay. Well, to go on to other things about this, we can keep talking for a very long time. I just have a couple of questions about the mechanics of writing the book in a certain sense, and also about its reception. So first of all, writing for someone like me is a very solitary process. So I'd be interested to know how the two of you managed to work together to collaborate on this book. What was the method?
I mean, you're correct. Writing is indeed a very solitary activity. But, like very early on, while I was thinking about the book, this was way back in 2013, 2014, when the democracy movement was picking up in Hong Kong, and I was wondering how come they have no elections, but far stronger civic rights and governing accountability, while we in India have elections, but so little governing accountability and fragile rights. And the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that I would not be able to do this by myself. I could do all the India research, I could do India, but I needed a democracy domain expert. And I think once you accept that you cannot do a book by yourself, collaboration becomes much easier because it becomes a matter of necessity. And true, me and John have very different styles and perspectives. He's an academic, though he's not an academic in the boring sense of the word. John is very open to new ideas, and he has a very um agile mind. Uh, when I say agile, I mean almost as agile as journalists who have very short attention spans. So, like they're interested in a lot of different things. John is a person like that. But we are very different people. We have very different perspectives, and there's a lot of difference of opinion. And the fact that we had to do it over Zoom made it even more difficult. Or the original plan was to base ourselves in Delhi for the last 3 months of writing, but then the pandemic happened, so the entire book was written over Zoom. But I would say that we managed to pull it off through actually democracy. Or the book came about, or the book came together rather, or through this process of constant deliberation, arguments, and consensus building. And it profited enormously from our differences, because anything that made it to the book had to be approved by both of us. So there was a built-in screening process, and the result was that by the time we handed over the final manuscript, there really wasn't much for the editor to do. We had so heavily edited each other that it was almost pitch perfect.
Okay.
May I
Sure.
compliment, let's compliment what Deb has said. Yes, it has been a great writing, personal and political adventure for me working with Deb. I spotted from the beginning that and knew that he was a world-class journalist, not such a great fan of breaking news journalism, certainly not an empty barrel journalist, as critics of journalism say. And so the journalist and the professor, worked for a couple of years hard on this. I think we were very much agreed that we needed each other. Me as a white guy needing, someone who knew the terrain, the topography of Indian politics and society, and someone who actually did field work for several months in India to make this book possible. We were also agreed that this was not a book that should be written in academic, so-called academic prose, and it's a problem with so much literature on democracy. Writing an academic book about democracy immediately cuts off readers, which rather contradicts the principle of democracy, of openness and accessibility. And although we challenge our readers, we don't consider them to be somehow ignorant or not at all. And part of the joy of writing with Deb was to try to draw together conceptual ideas, history, with characters and actual contexts, descriptions of context. So readers will find that there is an attempt to redefine the meaning of democracy, to tell the story of the adventure of India with democracy differently. But it's also laced with characters, Mrs. Gandhi, Mamata Didi Banerjee, there are crooks and goons and gangsters. There are, of course, characters such as B.R. Ambedkar, whose warnings from the 1940s and in the early 1950s have been confirmed. If you do not build a social welfare state, then democracy can't happen in India. That is another way of putting what we are also saying. And there are characters like Periyar Ramasamy, the Tamil founder of the self-respect movement, who appears. So this mixing together of field work, of conceptual ideas, of characters, of descriptions, of institutions, and putting them together with a big story. It's been a great adventure. My own thinking about democracy has been transformed by it. And it's been a great pleasure to work with Deb, although, as you are aware, Samrat, the book hit a reef upon publication in India.
Yeah. Well, the teamwork worked really well from reading the book, because it has the strengths of both the academic and the journalist. It's very solid and strong and good to read. you do mention the reef that you spoke about. So yeah, I do remember that there was some trouble getting it published in India. And what was that about? I mean, what happened?
John, do you want to go or
No,
shall I answer?
Debasish.
Okay, so the deal with OUP was that a week after the book is launched globally, it would be released in India. A cheaper edition would be released in India. And so that was the understanding, and we were working on the promotions and the rest accordingly. But suddenly they decided to. We were told that India OUP wanted another set of reviews. So, and we were very confused why they needed another review of the book when the book has already gone through an intensive, rigorous review process in London. But we were never given any explanation for that. We were just told that this is a routine thing for books in India. And but so we waited for a month and I think 2 months, but there was no word on the book, on the review, on what's happening. And around this time, I think we started, when people were asking us about, we had a month-end talk and journalists asked us about the availability of the book in the Indian market, and we started expressing our displeasure over the fact that the book is now available in Hong Kong and Estonia and not in India, for which the market for which we wrote the book. And so journalists started looking into it, and then it was then that OUP India told the journalists, so someone in Telegraph, I think, that they had decided not to print the book in India, but import it in limited numbers because they found the content provocative. That was the first time we came to know that they had a issue with the book, but they never told us. OUP India never told us. So then we.
Sorry to interrupt, but who did they think it would provoke? I mean, did was
I am not sure. And the bigger question is that when we submitted the manuscript 8-9 months ago, and we submitted the name of the book even before that, I think 6-7 months even before that. And the name of the book was To Kill a Democracy, India's Passage to Despotism. It was obviously not about gardening habits or Modi's love for wildlife, or, I mean, why were they not alert about the fact of this possibility of offending somebody? Because this was very clearly, I mean, it was very clear what the book was about, and if they thought that it's a risky venture, they could have told us early on, but they didn't. So we asked them. So when we realized that they are not going to print the book in India, we asked them to give us back our rights for South Asia. And then we approached different publishers, and Macmillan was very interested in the book, and we were very interested in Macmillan. So we were very lucky to finally have the book out after, I think, 6 months. But we did lose a lot of the synergy of joint global and India release. But better late than never.
Readers might be interested, may I add, that there is a one-page introduction in the book, and it in one way summarizes the experience that we had, and a very nerve-wracking and disappointing experience at that. It's an allegory of a kingdom where a ruler grows very jumpy at criticism and does everything to try to quash it, including having his men raid the libraries of the kingdom and throwing the books and precious manuscripts into a nearby river that run black with ink because so many are thrown in. And according to the allegory, I hope readers will read further than this, the writers in this kingdom actually stand up for the printed word and fearlessly take on the king. Well, this is an allegory about an imaginary kingdom, but it was written partly to capture the experience of what we went through. We are hoping very much that this book, thanks to conversations of this kind, Samrat, will have a long life. That it's a book that is not a potboiler. It's not about some immediate set of events. It is a new account of what has been happening to India and what could in future happen. It's not a grumpily pessimistic book. It tries to be utterly realistic about these trends, but it tries to reach readers in using a different approach, a different way of understanding democracy and why it really matters to Indians, but also the wider world.
Okay. Well, the reality does seem rather frightening and worrying, especially when we consider that this happened with this book itself. It's also not, as we spoke earlier, about any one particular party, perhaps. There may be an acceleration due to a certain party, but it's happened in smaller ways elsewhere as well. So given that, and given that the mechanics, the way politics is done in India is so similar, all political parties ultimately operate in other similar ways.
Right.
So given these facts, where is the room for optimism? What's the hopeful account at the end?
We, of course, end on a note of hope because we think that political monolithism is unworkable in India because it is so diverse, culturally diverse. And then there are very sharp democratic instincts which have been honed over the years by politics, political protests, activism, non-political activism. So that's how we end the book. But personally, I think that there is a lot of room for, there is room for correction if we concentrate on the fundamental problems of our politics, and there are many. For example, our situation is very similar to the Gilded Age, which you know is the period in America in the 20th century that saw tremendous industrialization and rapid economic growth, but also tremendous inequality and political corruption. So these parallels were evident even during the Congress rule, especially UPA 2. Now, because of these parallels with Gilded Age, it's, I think, instructive to look at the reforms that ended the Gilded Age in the US and began what is known as the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era was one of the things that happened in the Progressive Era was that the power of the party bosses ended and party primaries were instituted. And we have stressed in the book that the strangest thing about the world's biggest democracy is that there is no democracy within our political parties themselves. That has to change. So that will be the first step towards healing our democracy, and a very good way to start fixing political parties would be to starve them of funds, to force them to go back to the people and work for the people and raise money from the people rather than from money bags. But we have done the opposite by introducing electoral bonds. We have opened the floodgates of dark money into politics. So, like there are things like that, which if you tweak, which if there is a political consensus to work on, then I think there is a way forward, and it can be, there is room for redemption. There's one thing I would like to add here. I'll just take a couple of minutes if you indulge me, is that some of the solutions, of our broken democracy also lie beyond politics. If we look at the 3 decades after the Second World War, we see that both economic prosperity and political power were widely shared in Western Europe and North America. We need to look at the factors that enable this. And one very important factor was the rise of labor unions. In all these Western democracies, the rise of the unions played a major role in creating labor standards and wage levels that triggered the prosperity we see today. So, but what has happened now there as well as in India, particularly in India, is that the balance of power between labor and capital has decisively shifted in favor of capital. You can see this in the rise of contractual labor and informalization of labor. Labor rights are very much on the decline. This has to change. And because you cannot have a thriving democracy and weak labor rights at the same time. So you can never tackle economic inequality and political corruption without restoring the power balance between labor and capital. So there are all these things that if there is a mass movement, if there is a political consensus to address these issues, then there could be a better tomorrow.
May I again compliment Deb's remarks. Running through the book, if you like, the counterfactual in the narrative of the book, and it's made explicit at the end, is that a secure set of social foundations that encourage people to feel that they're capable of governing themselves, of living as equals in dignity. A civil society that's robust, dynamic, that a civil society, the regeneration of civil society in India and its various forces, including labor power, is a precondition of the renewed democratization in India. This time round, I think historically, in these years of the 21st century, not only labor, but also women's initiatives, and not to be forgotten, the defense of the right to be different becomes hugely important, and it's not something that political parties can do very well. It's got to come from below. It has to involve citizens who have to decide whether they're going to allow the degeneration, degradation of social life and the destruction of their democracy, or protect it. And one new, very new dynamic, which is underlined through the course of our book, is of course the greening of politics. You know, that the paying attention to the destruction of species, to the destruction of water and air and so on, is a political problem, and it immediately affects people in their everyday lives. So probably it's only my view, probably the reversal of the trends that we document in our book have to come from below, and they will take time, and they will have to involve citizens regrouping, reconsidering, options and priorities at the social level. One last thing, if I may, about democracy. It runs through the book again as a theme, but it becomes explicit at the end of the book, and it is the basis of the hope that's expressed in the book. We don't think our book is wishful thinking. We don't think it's an utterly depressing tragic drama of decline, because to the extent, Deb mentioned it, to the extent that the spirit of democracy has taken root in India, it has equipped people with a very important element of democracy. It's among the most fundamental elements, but very often neglected or not even thought about. A democracy is a way of handling power that encourages people to see that the way things are at the moment are not necessarily the way they must be in the near future. Democracies equip people with the sense that things can be changed. This is an old idea that goes back all the way to, for example, the Greeks. It remains relevant in the 21st century, and it is the basis of hope. In this respect, those who would want to build a Hindu majority, who want to build a more centralized polity, are going to have to confront that democratic spirit. They're going to have to persuade millions of Indians that this is the way things must go. This is the way the future will be. Any small d Democrats? We have a character, Mumbai's pothole Dada Bilhor, the whole feeling. Any everyday Democrat has instead the sense that this is not necessary, that democracy is worth embracing, and it's worth embracing because it's the best weapon that's so far been invented by humanity for dealing with abuse of power and bullying and violence. That's a clear choice, and we put it to readers that the value of democracy needs to be thought through, and that democracy gives people the opportunity and creates the possibility of things changing. That's the basis of democratic hope.
Okay. Well, I mean, I hope that that the way people think about changing things will be in this positive direction. Since we have some more time, one perhaps last question, because basically what we see is that while there is this desire for change, the direction of change, as you mentioned, is towards a Hindu Rashtra, and it is towards a unity, in the sense that a lot of the rhetoric now is about undoing the past. It is about doing away with Article 370, bringing a uniform civil code. In other words, creating unities. Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. Everything has to be one. One nation, one everything. One nation, one election. One nation, one something else. So given that there's such a strong push towards reducing everything to one, the diversity that sort of protects us from falling to despotism. Now, are you hopeful that the diversity will prevail against this push towards reducing everything to one?
I think personally, I mean, like that's the note on which we end the book. We feel that India's inherent diversity is a guarantor of democracy, because there is no other. India is not China. There is democracy is India's default setting. You cannot have any other system apart from democracy. And what we are going through at the moment is this imposition of idea of unified culture, which at some point, and you can see this, you saw this during the Bengal election, this begins to militate against the regional pride. So, and the more you try to push it, or the more the regional aspects of identity will militate against it. because this kind of politics can often seem like a cultural imposition. Because when you talk about one culture has to be derived from one particular part of India, right? You cannot have a mix of cultures. So if you are trying to impose one culture, then that culture will come from a part of India, and others might not necessarily agree with that culture. So yes, I think India's diversity is a hedge against autocratic rule. Uh, and I mean, that's of course why our belief and our hope. But
May I add that in the book, we point out early on that India, among the things that India did to the whole idea of democracy, was introduce, to reimagine democracy and to introduce institutions that suppose that the country was itself heterogeneous, that it was pluralistic, and that democracy was a protection of that pluralism, of that diversity. That might seem obvious to many people today, but it wasn't obvious in the middle of the 20th century. And indeed, if you look at old man Churchill, you know, he said repeatedly against Indian independence and against the whole argument that there should be parliamentary democracy and sovereignty in India. He said, you know, no polity, no society can possibly build a power-sharing democracy with rule of law unless it has a unified sense of nationhood, you know, social homogeneity. That view in the history of democracy was prevalent. The irony, so India set out on the pathway of proving Churchill was wrong. What is ironic for me, about the current trends to try to build a new people that is supposedly homogeneous and to produce a country that is unified, it's an old European idea. You know, that's one of the bitter ironies of this trend. And Deb is, I think, right, and we try to say forcefully towards the end that this is one of the great barriers against the transformation of Indian democracy into a despotism. Those who want a despotism will have to destroy, they will physically have to destroy the heterogeneity of the society. And there's one other thing to say that might add to the sense of hope at the end of the book, and it has to do with the respect for difference. There are the first signs globally after COVID-19 of altered governments. Countries, Chile is the best current example, where after a lot of suffering and a lot of social marginalization, a lot of degradation of social foundations, civil society puts together a coalition and catapults a party and a leader into office, where the language of democracy begins to flourish again, where democracy means a form of self-government backed by elected politicians, yes, where the right to be different and the right to equalization of differences is sacrosanct. It's too early to tell whether this might be one of the new trends of these years of the 21st century, but I think our book recommends that really seriously be put on the table as an option of thinking about how to counter this strange, regressive, despotic politics of homogenization, which would require minimally the marginalization, invisibilization, jailing, forcing into exile of 200 million Muslims, for example. This would be the way to destroy democracy if it happened.
Well, this was an excellent discussion, illuminating, and thank you very much, John and Deb. And I would encourage readers to read for themselves the book and reflect more deeply than we tend to do about the issues that surround our politics. So thank you both very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samrat.
And
Thank you, Samrat.
look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.